Hi, welcome back to Grains in Small Places, and today we're going to be making a marbled rye bread with fresh milled flour. So let's get started. Okay, so to get started, we're going to measure out our wheat berries, and we need about 500 grams total, and we're going to be using hard white wheat. You could also use hard red wheat. You may need a little bit more if you use the hard red wheat. And we're going to use a little bit of rye berries. So I'm going to go ahead. You want to make sure that you're using a mostly hard wheat so that you can get that gluten development. Once I weigh out my wheat berries, I'm going to do 400 grams of hard white wheat and 100 grams of rye, and that should give me 500 grams of wheat berries, which when it's milled, it will give me 500 grams of flour. Now that doesn't necessarily work the same if you're doing by volume. So 1 cup of wheat berries does not equal 1 cup of flour. There I go to talking and I overfilled. Okay. $3.99, I'll take that. Okay, and then I'll make sure to put in the description box below a link to all the things you see me using. Like, I get a lot of questions about these little storage bins for my everyday use, my scale, my mixer, my mill, all the things. All right, and then we want to get a total of 500 grams, so I'm looking at about 100 of the rye. And I did also want to show you how beautiful these rye berries are. And I think it's just so interesting to see how different all of the wheat berries are. I've had some people message me before saying that they think their rye berries have gone bad because they're green or purplish in color, but that's actually absolutely normal. So let's go ahead and head on over to my mill. Today we're using the Nutrimill Impact Mill. I have been loving using this mill. It makes nice fine flour. It's really easy to use. This is a fantastic mill for a beginner. I'll make sure to put a coupon code for $20 off your mill or mixer at the Nutrimill store. And the coupon code is Grainy. I will stick that in the description box below. Okay, so while you're milling your flour, you can go ahead and measure out your other ingredients. I'm going to go ahead and get a cup of water, which is about 240 grams. I'll make sure to put a link to the recipe down in the description box below. That way you can follow along with the weights or the volume. I try to make it both ways. And while that was milling, I went ahead and measured out my butter. We're using about 2 tablespoons of that, which is 28 grams. And I'm gonna just melt this down a little bit so that it's easier to incorporate in the dough. You can use olive oil if you prefer here, or even lard or tallow. I just like a nice grass-fed butter, so we're gonna go ahead and just melt this down. And here is our freshly milled flour. We've got the hard white wheat and the rye in there. So I'm gonna go ahead and grab my mixer. Okay, so as you all know, I have my Ankerson mixer and I now have this Bosch mixer. And I promised some extra videos on this. I've had a chance to use this mixer a lot more and get a lot more familiar than when the very first time my review video I did on this, which was the first time I had ever used it. So I'm excited to show you just how quickly this can knead your fresh milled flour dough. So I'm gonna start out, I'm gonna go ahead and put that water in the mixer. Okay, and then we're gonna add in this softened butter here. And we are making this marbled rye. So if you like a dark rye bread, you could just turn this whole thing all into dark rye by basically doubling what we're going to put into the darker dough. And then if you like just a white rye or a light rye, you can just omit the cocoa powder and molasses. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna take this whole batch of dough and make one big batch of dough and then divide that in half, and then I'll show you when we get there. But this is going to make a large 5x9 loaf, which I'm going to use my Lodge cast iron bread pan. Now, I believe this is advertised as a 4.5 by 8.5, but because it has larger sides, I find that I'm able to use this like a 5x9 inch pan. So I could get one large loaf of this with this recipe, or if you have smaller pans like my old pans that I used to have, that were the really little 4x8, or if you want 2 small loaves, you can take this whole thing and divide it in half and get 2 small loaves instead of this one large loaf. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and use about 2 tablespoons of, I'm using maple syrup today. You could use honey, you could use sugar, raw cane sugar, whatever sweetener that you prefer. I'm kind of adapting my maple bread loaf. It seems to be a very popular bread loaf. A lot of people like it. We love it. So I decided, let's take that loaf, cut back the sugar, and turn it into a marbled rye. So we just made a few little changes. And again, I'll make sure to put the recipe in the description box below. That way you have it. Okay, we're gonna do 1.5 teaspoons of salt. This is my half a teaspoon. As you all know, I have been loving this Baja Gold salt. I do have a coupon code for you that you can save 10% off of your order from them. I'll put that in the description box below as well. I love it for my baking. I love it for my cooking and everything. Okay, and then we're going to use caraway seeds. Now, if you've never made rye bread before, you may not know this, but the rye flavor actually comes from these caraway seeds. So the rye wheat berries themselves actually don't have that strong, what you think of when you think of rye flavor. So I'm gonna add 2 teaspoons. This is my same half a teaspoon. If you like the, when you open these, you smell them, you will know what I'm talking about. But if you like a really strong flavor of this, you can always increase the amount. But I know that not everybody loves this flavor. You can also grind them or smash them if you want, and you could also top your loaf with these, is another thing that you can do. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and give this a little mix. I'm gonna put my lid on. All right, and then I'm going to add my flour. So this is the hard white wheat and the rye all milled together. And I'm just gonna mix that in. Okay, so there's one more thing that I've been playing and experimenting with. As you all know, in the past, I've always used, or usually have used, instant yeast, and I let you know how you can make the recipes with active dry yeast. But some of you brought it to my attention that this instant yeast and most other instant yeasts have a couple ingredients in them that I don't love. So this sorbitan monostrate and ascorbic acid. Honestly, I never even thought to look at the ingredient list on my yeast. So I have been playing around more with active dry yeast. So I also, as you know, I do have sourdough starter. I do stuff with my sourdough, but I don't always use sourdough. Sometimes I use yeast, sometimes I use sourdough. But I found, did look at the ingredients, and the ingredients in this one is only yeast. So if you have a favorite yeast out there that you love that doesn't have a bunch of things in it, this is the only one that I could find that didn't at my local grocery store. So normally I would buy yeast in like large bulk, but they only had it in the packets. So I'm gonna go ahead and instead of, I always say to autolyze this without the yeast, but since this is the active dry yeast, you can bloom this beforehand if you prefer. But I have been experimenting with this and putting it in with my dough before the autolyze. And I know that sounds really weird if you've watched any of my other videos from what I would normally do, but we're gonna go ahead and do this before the autolyze. All right, we're gonna mix that in. And honestly, let's see. Okay, and I'm going to say, just by the looks of this, it does look a little bit dry, so I'm going to adjust my water. Every time I make a loaf of bread, sometimes I need more water, sometimes I need more flour. So you just kind of have to go with the texture of the dough, how it looks and feels. 2 days ago, it was rainy here and just so gloomy, and making exact same recipes that I always make were way too wet. I had to add a tiny bit more flour. Today, the sun is shining, everything's dried up, and now I've got dough that looks slightly dry. So always go by what your dough is telling you over just recipes on a piece of paper, because the recipes are always changing. Even for me making it in the same location with the same wheat berries and the same mixer and the same water and everything, it still varies even for me just a little bit. Okay, I'm gonna add about 40 grams or so of water. I will make sure to update the recipe down below. But again, always go with the texture of your dough. Okay, let's go ahead and give that a mix in and see what we get here. That's still dry. Oh, I forgot my egg. Okay, so it still seems really dry, and I just re-looked at my maple bread recipe and realized I forgot to account for the egg, which is a liquid. So I actually have a total here of about 1.5 cups of water. I will make sure to put that down below. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and let this do an autolyze step. I still feel like it's dry. So this actually, if you were using white flour, would probably be good to stop here, but I also did not account for the dryness of the caraway seeds. So we're in this together. We're doing some recipe testings, but it just, by the feel I'm going by, it just feels a little on the dry side. So I'm gonna go ahead and let this do the autolyze step, and then we'll check the texture of it. So we'll be back. We're gonna cover this, let it sit for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll be back to check on it. Okay, it's about 10, 15 minutes. Let's see what we got here. Okay, that's looking a lot better. I'm glad that I let it autolyze a bit. That way it could start absorbing all of that liquid in there that I added extra. Typically, I've been kneading this on between the 1 and 2, well, on the 1 or the 2 in this Bosch mixer. I set a timer for 5 minutes because I don't want this to over knead. This mixer can easily over knead your dough because it kneads so quickly. But I will say, if your dough is not the right texture, so if it's too wet or too dry, then that time may not work for you. So just look at your dough. If you think it looks too wet and it's like not even grabbing up in the mixing paddles at all, then you may want to add just a little bit more flour. If it's so dry that it's just kind of like a compact ball and you know it's never going to get like nice and stretchy, you're going to want to add liquid to it. So I'm going to go ahead and let this knead on level 2 for 5 minutes and no longer, and then we'll come back and we'll check it. Okay, it has been 5 minutes, and I don't want to over knead this, but I can see signs of beautiful gluten development. I can tell the dough is nice and stretchy here and here. So I don't want to over knead this, because what we're going to do is divide this in half and then add in some more ingredients to half of this dough. So I'm going to go ahead and butter or oil or something. I always have softened butter out, but I'm just going to take a separate bowl because we do need basically 2 different doughs here. Okay, we're going to be making these 2 different doughs out of this one dough. So I wanted to make sure I had somewhere to put half of this. So let me go ahead and look at the texture of this dough that we have here. So that is nice and stretchy. It will break, if you can see here. So I know that you've seen many window pane things. If you do this, and this is nice and stretchy, this is what you want. If it tears, there, I got it to tear. If it tears a little bit, that's okay. This is still passing the window pane test. So I wanted to make sure that you understood that. I know I've seen some people say, well, I thought I had a window pane test, but then it ripped. But that's okay if it does have a little bit of a rip when you're stretching it. And you just don't want it to have no stretch at all. You're just looking for nice stretchy dough. That's just the best way to describe it. So if you want, you can take this dough out, weigh it, cut it perfectly in half. I'm just gonna eyeball this. But you can see it's nice and stretchy. The dough wants to stay together even when I'm pulling it out. Okay. And it still is somewhat sticky, which is fine. It will help if you get your hands wet or put some of that butter on your hands. So let's see. Okay. I'm just going to kind of pull this into a dough ball. It's okay if it's all over your hands. Honestly, okay, a little bit more. I guess it's easier to eyeball it if I were to pull it out. All right, so I'm going to take this dough out. This will be our light color dough. And I'm going to cover that. And we're going to let this rise. While we play with our darker colored dough, we're just going to add 2 more things to this dough. Let me just wash my hands really quick. Okay, also wanted to mention, I do think it's important, the lid when you're mixing in the Bosch, when I first mix up all my wet ingredients with my dry ingredients, in order for it to not to fly out of the bowl, I do put my lid on. But when I'm mixing my dough and kneading it, I don't want it to get too hot in here. So I do not mix with the lid on. It is something I've learned from using this. I just use the lid for the initial mix, and then again I can use it for proofing. So to this second batch, now this is because we're making a marbled rye that we're doing this in 2 different doughs. Again, I had mentioned if you want to make just a light rye or just a dark rye, that you can just make one or the other. We're going to add about a tablespoon of cocoa powder. If you want it to be really dark and dramatic, you can buy the black cocoa powder. This is just regular. And then we're going to add about a tablespoon of molasses. So if you don't like the flavor of molasses, you can use maple syrup or brown sugar here. But the molasses is kind of one of those traditional flavors in rye. Okay, and we're just going to mix those ingredients just until it's incorporated. It may be difficult with this small amount of dough, so I may have to go in there with my spatula or my hands. We'll give it a second and see how it goes. Okay, I can see it doesn't want to grab some of this. I'm just going to scrape the sides here and give it a little help. This is a very small amount of dough. It's just the half of the batch we were working with. And I don't want to over knead it by just leaving it in here, because I do think it would eventually incorporate it, but it may need too long. Okay. Okay. So I just took it another minute or so. If you want to do this part by hand, of course you can do that. It is a little bit of a sticky dough, so it may make it a little messy to incorporate it all, but eventually it'll all get in there. Okay, so I think I'm good with this. I'm going to go ahead and just pull out the mixing paddle. Okay, I got my hands just a little bit wet this time to play with the dough. So I just wanted to show you the darker dough, and I did knead it maybe about 1 or 2 minutes longer, so you can see how nice and stretchy this dough is. I'm just gonna make it into a little ball here. Make sure we have all of the little bits and pieces. And then I'm going to just let this one rise inside of the mixing bowl here. You can spray this with oil or butter it. I've not really had much of an issue with just putting it in here and then pulling it out later. So I'm going to go ahead and just smash this in here. And this one's going to get covered and we're going to let it rise. This could take somewhere between 1 and 2 hours, depending on your yeast, how warm it is in your kitchen. I'm gonna check on it in about an hour, and once this dough is doubled, we'll go ahead and move on to the shaping, which is the beautiful part where we get to roll it together. Alrighty, I'm just gonna use the lid that comes with it. We'll cover that. I will bring you back when these are done rising. So we have our light dough and our dark dough. So we will be back. Now, if you have a different mixer, your time will be very different. This 5 minutes is specific to this Bosch or the Artiste mixer. If you have a KitchenAid or a Anchorsome or any of the other mixers, it's probably going to be a lot longer than 5 minutes. Just go to when the dough is nice and stretchy, stop it, divide it, and then come back and add the ingredients to the dark dough. So always go by what your dough looks and feels like. You just want it to be nice and stretchy before you move to the next step. Okay, so our lighter dough has doubled. You can see maybe. And the darker dough has risen. It's not quite completely double, but we're gonna go ahead and go with that. It's been about an hour and a half. I'm gonna take my pan here and I'm going to just butter it pretty heavily. I've not had any problems with the cast iron pans sticking with my dough as long as I butter it heavily. I find oil just doesn't seem to do the job. It just still sticks. So just a thick coating of butter is just about perfect. Plus it helps improve the flavor anyway. So I'm just gonna put this around. I seem to always have softened butter on my counter nowadays because we're using it for almost all of our baking and cooking needs. So I usually always have some kind of softened butter on my counter. And if not, I will try to make sure to remember to grab one out before I start a recipe that I know is gonna need a baking pan, which is almost all of my recipes in some way or another. So if you have a different pan, you can use parchment paper. You can coat this with whatever works for you, but this has really been nice for me. Okay, I'm gonna set this pan to the side while I grab my light dough. It smells delicious. I'm gonna give it a little punch down. And I'm gonna grab my little bed scraper here because I might need it. Okay. I'm just going to push this down into a little rectangle. So I'm looking at the size of my pan. So when I go to roll this up, I want about the size of my pan. And if your dough is sticking to the counter, you can always put a little bit of oil on your hands and work surface, or butter, softened butter even, or even a little bit of flour. Okay, so I'm looking at the size of my pan to the amount of dough that I have here. That looks close. I don't mind it being slightly smaller, because when I go to roll it up, it seems to always get a little longer. Okay, and here's my dark dough. It would be nice if I had a larger work surface, because then I could flatten this dough independently. But the only larger work surface I have is not easy to... It's my table, and it's not as easy to get the camera in there, especially when we're using it for other things. So I'm just going to, ideally, you want to flatten this dough separately and then lay it on top, but I'm going to just attempt to flatten it out over top. So if you have a larger workspace, you're going to have better results probably if you flatten this separately and then lay it on top. Okay. Now we have our dark dough on top of our light dough. And I'm just going to use this to make sure it's not sticking on the edge. And we're just going to roll this up. You want to try to make it somewhat tight so that you don't have giant air bubbles in there. Okay, so we have basically like a cinnamon roll, but no cinnamon. I'm just going to make sure that we have our little edges pinched in, and then I'm going to try to tuck all of this dark dough in. We may have a little breakage or sealage breakage. Do the same thing for this side. Just pinching that all together. Okay, and then I have my dough pan here, and I'm just going to flip this over seam side down and place it in my buttered pan. Okay. I can feel a couple air bubbles in here that I'm going to just pop, because I don't want those to do wonky things. Okay, I'm gonna cover that pan and let it rise for probably somewhere between 40 and 90 minutes. I wanna check the poke test. So if you poke on the dough and it springs right back up, you get your finger a little wet. If you poke on the dough and it springs right back up, it still needs to rise a little bit longer. If you poke on the dough and it comes back slowly, then you're good to go ahead and bake. If you poke on the dough and it stays down, it may be slightly overproof, so you want to get it in the oven before it gets to that point. One of you had recommended to use these so that I could reuse them instead of using so much plastic wrap. So we're going to go ahead and set this on to the side while we let it rise. Okay, you're going to preheat your oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. It's going to bake somewhere between 45 and 55 minutes. You want to make sure that you check the center of the loaf for the internal temperature. It should be around 190 or slightly higher degrees Fahrenheit. Then that's how you know it's done. Okay, so this is pretty much like not quite all the way to the top of the pan, but don't ever go just by if it's at the top of the pan. You want to do the little bit of a poke test. Okay, so into the oven it goes. Alrighty, it is done and it smells delicious. So we have a little cracking here, but who's perfect, right? So I'm gonna go ahead and dump this out onto my cooling rack so it can start to cool. And then we will slice into it after it cools a little bit. So we'll be back. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today while we made this beautiful marbled rye bread. Now, I do want to let you know that once we tasted it and tried it, we thought that it did need just a little bit more of the caraway seeds. So I'm going to update that in the recipe for you. So I would probably use 3 teaspoons or 1 tablespoon of the caraway seeds. And then if you like a really strong rye flavor, you could put even more than that in there. Just kind of play with it and see how you like it and your family likes it the best. I'll make sure to link that recipe down below, and you can find that recipe and a whole bunch of other recipes all dedicated to fresh milled flour at grainsandsmallplaces.net. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. And thanks for stopping by Grains and Small Places. Goodbye.